On a winter night in Rome, the city held its breath. Not because of cold, but because everyone knew what the sound meant. Armored footsteps echoed through narrow streets, slow and deliberate, stopping where they chose. Lamps flickered behind shuttered windows. Families froze in place, listening, counting the seconds, praying the sound would pass their door and move on. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it stopped. Inside one house, a girl lay half awake, wrapped in wool, her thoughts still tangled in sleep. She was young enough to believe the world outside her walls was orderly, governed by rules she had been taught to obey. Her name had never been spoken in fear before. Tonight, it would be. A knock came. Not loud, not violent, certain. Her mother understood immediately. She covered her mouth, not to scream, but to stop herself from saying her daughter's name out loud, as if sound itself might summon something worse. Her father straightened his robe, hands shaking just enough to betray him. He already knew there would be no arguing, no bargaining, no delay. Outside stood men carrying no weapons in their hands. They did not need them. One held a scroll sealed in imperial purple. Another carried a lantern, its light dulled beneath red cloth. That lantern was placed at the door. It was not a warning, it was a mark. Neighbors would see it at dawn and understand what had happened here. They would lower their eyes and say nothing. In Rome, silence was survival. The girl was called forward. She had done nothing wrong. There was no charge, no accusation, no explanation. Only the emperor's name, written cleanly in wax, and a summons that could not be refused. She was told this was an honor. That word had been carefully chosen. Honor meant obedience. Honor meant gratitude. Honor meant she was expected to walk forward without resisting, without crying out, without asking why. Her parents embraced her as if sending her to a ceremony. Their smiles broke the moment her back was turned. As she stepped into the street, she looked once more at the house where she had been a daughter. She would never belong to it again. The men did not hurry her. There was no need. Rome itself moved her forward. Every law, every custom, every whispered fear guided her steps toward the hill where the palace waited. She did not yet know what awaited her there, but Rome did. And Rome knew something else, something far more terrible. In this city, death was not the worst fate a young woman could suffer. Sometimes survival was. Rome called itself a civilization of laws. That was the lie that made everything else possible. By the 1st century, the empire had perfected a dangerous illusion that power was restrained by tradition, balanced by the Senate, softened by custom. In reality, all of it bent toward a single figure. The emperor was not merely a ruler. He was lawgiver, judge, military commander, and living symbol of the god's favor. His word did not interpret the law. His word was the law. To refuse him was not disobedience, it was treason. This is why no door stayed closed when the summons came. Not because families were weak or cruel or complicit by nature, but because Rome had engineered obedience so thoroughly that resistance felt unthinkable. A father who said no did not simply endanger himself. He endangered his wife, his sons, his extended family, his household slaves, even distant relatives who shared his name. Confiscation of property was automatic. Exile was common. Execution was routine. And execution was often the mercy. Rome did not need to drag daughters screaming from their homes. It trained parents to hand them over themselves. The language mattered. The summons was never described as a seizure. It was framed as a selection, a recognition. a privilege bestowed upon noble blood. To be chosen by the emperor meant your family mattered. It meant your lineage had value. It meant Rome had seen you. And in a society obsessed with honor, visibility was everything. Refusal carried its own stain. To deny the emperor's request was to imply suspicion, to suggest corruption, to hint that your household had something to hide. That suspicion lingered long after punishment ended. In Rome, reputations did not recover. They fossilized. So fathers rehearsed smiles. Mothers practiced stillness. Families told themselves comforting lies because the truth was too dangerous to name. They said the girls would serve in ceremonies. They said they would be protected. They said the palace was not a place of harm, but of order. Even the girls were taught to believe this. From childhood, noble daughters learned obedience as a virtue, silence as grace, endurance as strength. They were raised to understand that their bodies were political instruments long before they belonged to themselves. Marriage was already a transaction. The palace was simply a larger one. What made this system so effective was not fear alone, but isolation. Each family believed they were alone in their suffering, that theirs was a singular burden, an exceptional demand, a private tragedy. Rome ensured they never spoke to one another, never compared notes, never assembled a shared truth. Silence kept them divided, division kept them obedient, and above it all stood the emperor, distant, untouchable, divine in image if not in spirit. His desires were never framed as impulses. They were framed as destiny, as necessity, as the natural order of things. By the time the knock came, the decision had already been made centuries earlier. The girl stepping into the street did not yet understand this, but her parents did. They understood that in Rome, you did not protect your children by fighting power. You protected them by surviving it. And sometimes, survival demanded a price that could never be repaid. Caligula was not born into obscurity. He was born into adoration. His father, Germanicus, was everything Rome admired in a man. Brilliant in battle, generous in victory, beloved by soldiers and civilians alike. Crowds filled the streets just to see him pass. Legionaries swore loyalty to him with a devotion usually reserved for gods. In another life, he would have ruled Rome by sheer acclaim. Caligula grew up in the shadow of that worship. As a child, he followed the legions from frontier to frontier, not through gardens or lecture halls, but through camps thick with sweat, iron and blood. He learned to walk between rows of hardened soldiers before he learned to read. The men laughed when they saw him dressed in a miniature uniform, tiny boots strapped to his feet. They called him Little Boot. It was meant as affection. It became his name. In those camps, he learned his first lesson. Power does not come from virtue. It comes from obedience. Soldiers obeyed because they feared punishment and respected strength. Generals ruled because they controlled violence. Order was not moral, it was enforced. Then the world he knew collapsed. Germanicus died suddenly under suspicious circumstances. Rome mourned, the people wept. But grief did not protect his family. It painted a target on them. The emperor Tiberius did not tolerate rivals, especially beloved ones. Caligula watched as his mother was exiled. His brothers were imprisoned, starved, executed. One by one, the people he loved vanished into the machinery of the state. There were no charges that mattered, no defenses that worked. The law had already decided. Caligula learned his second lesson. In Rome, innocence does not save you. Visibility kills you. Eventually, he was summoned to Capri. Officially, it was an honor, a chance to live in the emperor's presence. In reality, It was a cage. Capri was where power went to rot in private. Far from Rome's eyes, the emperor ruled through paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty. No one was trusted. Everyone was watched. Caligula lived there for years. He ate at the same table as the man who had destroyed his family. He laughed at his jokes. He praised his wisdom. He survived by becoming invisible, by showing no anger, no grief, no ambition. Every emotion was a liability. Every reaction could be fatal. This was not a childhood. It was an apprenticeship. Caligula learned how absolute power behaves when it believes itself unseen. He learned that cruelty does not need justification when no one can object. He learned that humiliation is more effective than execution because it breaks people without ending their usefulness. Most of all, he learned restraint, not the kind that tempers violence, but the kind that stores it. To live, he smiled at the man he hated. To survive, he buried himself. By the time Tiberius died, Caligula had mastered the most important skill Rome could teach. He knew how to wait. When the Senate proclaimed him emperor, the city erupted in celebration. The son of Germanicus had returned. Prisoners were freed. Informers were silenced. Taxes were lifted. Gold flowed. Rome believed a nightmare had ended. What they did not see was what Capri had carved into him. The boy who learned to hide every thought had grown into a man who understood something terrifying. If silence could keep him alive, imagine what fear could do for him. And when power finally belonged to him, completely and without limit, Caligula no longer needed to pretend to be human. He was done waiting. For the first months of his reign, Caligula behaved exactly as Rome hoped he would. He smiled in public. He spoke of mercy. He honored his father's memory. He released prisoners and burned the records of informers. He paid for games, feasts, spectacles that made the city feel young again. The people praised him not just as a ruler, but as a deliverance. Rome wanted to believe in him, and Caligula understood that belief was a resource. Then, near the end of his first year, his body collapsed. The illness came suddenly and violently. Fever, delirium, convulsions. For days, Rome was told its emperor was dying. Temples filled with prayers. Senators made vows to the gods. Some even promised their own lives in exchange for his recovery. Caligula hovered between life and death, and when he rose from that bed, something essential did not rise with him. The man who emerged was not weaker. He was clearer. He had seen how Rome reacted when it thought he might die. He had watched the fear ripple outward, felt the city tighten around his absence. He had learned what his life was worth to others, not in affection, but in dependence. From that moment on, restraint vanished. The generosity did not end. It twisted. Mercy became performance. Punishment became theater. The Senate still met, but it no longer mattered. Their silence was no longer caution. It was submission. Caligula began to speak differently. He did not argue. He declared. He did not persuade. He commanded. He spoke of himself not as a man elevated by Rome, but as a figure placed above it. Temples rose bearing his image. Priests adjusted their rituals. Statues blurred the line between emperor and god, and no one objected loudly enough to matter. Rome had trained itself well. At the top of the Palatine Hill, looking down over the city, Caligula reached a conclusion that no law could stop and no tradition could soften. If no one stood above him, then everyone below him existed for use. This was not madness. It was logic. Power no longer needed justification. Desire no longer needed disguise. Limits no longer existed except where he chose to imagine them. And what he imagined was shaped by everything he had endured. loss without justice, obedience without dignity, survival without mercy. The world had taught him that control was safety, so he decided to control everything. Justice became arbitrary. Favor became dangerous. The line between reward and punishment dissolved until both served the same purpose, reminding Rome that its fate lived in one body. And in that new understanding, another thought began to form. Not sudden, not impulsive, inevitable. Rome's noble women had always been symbols of alliance, of lineage, of honor. Their bodies were already political, their marriages already negotiated, their futures already arranged. Caligula simply removed the final illusion. If daughters could be traded to secure peace between families, why not claim to demonstrate absolute power? If obedience defined virtue, why not test obedience at its most intimate boundary? No law forbade it, no god denied it, no man dared challenge it. And so, quietly at first, without proclamation or spectacle, the palace changed. Certain corridors closed, certain doors were sealed, certain summons were written with careful language and delivered at night. Rome did not notice the moment it crossed the line, but for the girls who would soon be called forward, the world had already ended. They just didn't know it yet. The summons did not lead to a throne room. That was the first mistake. The girls were brought through side entrances, down corridors most Romans never knew existed. Marble gave way to softer stone. Torches were spaced farther apart, sound thinned. Even footsteps seemed to vanish before they could echo. The palace had many faces. This one was designed not to be remembered. They were told they had entered a place of service, a protected wing, a secluded space reserved for those chosen by the emperor himself. The words were careful, polished, meant to soothe. They worked, at first. The rooms were beautiful, walls washed in pale color, floors cool and smooth beneath bare feet, beds draped in fine fabric, perfumes lingering in the air, unfamiliar and expensive. Servants moved silently, anticipating needs before they were spoken. It did not feel like a prison. That illusion lasted just long enough to be dangerous. The first thing taken was time. Days were not marked. Nights arrived without warning. No bells rang. No schedules were given. The girls slept when exhaustion overtook them and woke unsure how long they had been unconscious. Without time, the mind lost its grip. Waiting became endless. Thought became circular. Then came the second theft. Names disappeared. Servants stopped using them. Guards never asked. When the emperor spoke, he replaced them with numbers, jokes, or distortions that twisted identity into something unrecognizable. A name tied you to a family, a history, a place in the world. Without it, you became interchangeable, replaceable. The clothing reinforced the lesson. Silks that revealed more than they concealed. Jewelry heavy enough to remind the wearer of its weight with every movement. Nothing worn for comfort. Everything designed to signal ownership. They were not dressed for dignity. They were dressed for display. But the most effective weapon was not silk or gold or silence. It was uncertainty. They never knew when the summons would come. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. And in that not knowing, fear did its deepest work. Each footstep in the hallway tightened the chest. Each shadow lengthened the breath. Sleep became shallow and fragile. Waking became dread. By the time a girl was called forward, her resistance had already been dismantled. The place did not break them quickly. That would have been inefficient. It broke them slowly, carefully, ensuring they understood every step of their own undoing. And all the while, the palace functioned normally above them. Banquets continued. Senators debated policy. Rome argued over taxes and borders and omens. Life went on, uninterrupted, while beneath it, a system operated with precision. This was not chaos. It was administration. The girls were never told what would happen to them. That knowledge would have offered clarity. Clarity would have allowed preparation. Instead, they were given comfort without safety, beauty without freedom, attention without explanation. Hope flickered constantly, and that made everything worse. Because hope convinced them that obedience might still protect them, that patience might still be rewarded, that endurance might still be enough. By the time the truth revealed itself, it arrived not as a shock, but as a confirmation. The place without names had never been meant to house people. It was meant to erase them. And somewhere beyond its sealed doors, Caligula waited, not in haste, not in passion, but with the calm certainty of a man who believed the world existed to answer when he called. Death in Rome was sudden, a blade, a fall. Poison swallowed in the dark. However brutal, it ended something. It closed the door. It gave the mind no time to rehearse fear again and again. What waited inside the palace was different. Here, suffering was stretched, measured, repeated until it reshaped the person enduring it. The girls were not beaten into submission. They were unmade. Every day began the same way, with uncertainty, not knowing whether they would be left alone or called forward, not knowing whether kindness from a servant was genuine or part of a test, not knowing whether silence meant safety or simply delay. Waiting became its own punishment. The mind cannot endure constant anticipation without breaking. Muscles stay tense. Breath shortens. Thoughts spiral inward. Fear stops being a response and becomes a state of existence. Even moments of calm felt dangerous because calm never lasted. Slowly, something inside them shifted. They stopped thinking in terms of escape. They stopped imagining futures. They stopped measuring time by days. Survival narrowed to the next hour, the next sound in the corridor, the next footstep that might stop outside their door. This was the cruelty that left no bruises. Identity dissolved first. Without names, without mirrors that reflected anything recognizable, without roles other than obedience, the girls began to feel less like people and more like objects waiting to be used. Memory followed. Some forgot the sound of their father's voice. Others struggled to picture their homes as if those places had belonged to someone else. Childhood felt unreal, like a story overheard long ago. And then came the most dangerous moment of all. Acceptance, not consent, not agreement, but the quiet internal surrender that arrives when resistance feels pointless. When the body learns that endurance is less painful than defiance. When hope stops looking like rescue and starts looking like disappearance. At that point, death changed its meaning. Death was no longer the threat whispered to keep them obedient. Death became the comparison, the alternative, the line against which every day was measured. Some girls began to think of it not with fear, but with longing. Death promised silence. Death promised rest. Death promised an end to waiting. Living meant waking each day stripped of self, rehearsing terror, and knowing that even survival carried consequences that would follow them forever. This is why what happened inside the palace was worse than death. Death ends suffering. This system preserved it. It taught the girls to breathe, to walk, to smile, while something essential inside them withered. It kept their bodies intact just long enough to ensure their minds understood the full scope of what had been taken. By the time some of them wished for death, they no longer wished to die. They wished to stop existing. And in Rome, a person who no longer sees themselves as human is already lost. That was the emperor's true achievement, not the acts themselves, but the transformation they caused. He did not need to kill his victims. He turned survival into the punishment. Caligula could not have built this alone, not because he lacked power, but because power only works when others choose not to see what it is doing. The palace did not operate in isolation. It was fed by the city itself, by its laws, its customs, its fears, and most of all, by its silences. Fathers knew where their daughters had gone. They were never told explicitly, but they did not need to be. The palace did not hide its authority. It relied on something far more effective: implication. A shared understanding that questions were dangerous and answers even more so. Some fathers were summoned to banquets. They sat at tables heavy with food and gold, surrounded by men who governed Rome by day and pretended nothing was wrong by night. Wine was poured, toasts were made, and somewhere nearby, their daughters waited, listening, learning what it meant to be abandoned without being disowned. The fathers smiled because they had to. A tightened jaw could be interpreted as defiance. Averted eyes could be read as judgment. In a court where informers thrived, even grief required discipline. Any sign of discomfort could condemn not just the man, but the girl whose suffering he dared to acknowledge. So Rome learned a new etiquette. Do not ask, do not react, do not remember. Senators were drawn in next. Caligula understood that terror works best when it is shared, when everyone has something to lose, when guilt binds tighter than loyalty ever could. Men who debated law and virtue in public were made to participate in private, not always directly, sometimes by presence, sometimes by silence, sometimes simply by knowing and doing nothing. Once compromised, they became predictable. A man who has already crossed a line is easier to control than one who has not. Caligula ensured that Rome's elite crossed that line together. Shared shame became a leash. No one could expose the truth without destroying themselves in the process. Even the palace servants were trapped. They saw everything. They carried messages. They cleaned rooms that told stories no one was allowed to hear. But they were enslaved, watched, replaceable. A whispered word could mean death. A single tear seen by the wrong eyes could be reported as rebellion. So they hardened themselves. They moved like shadows. They obeyed. They survived. This was how the system sustained itself. Not through constant violence, but through normalization, through repetition, through the quiet agreement that this was simply how things were now. Rome told itself comforting stories, that the emperor's desires were temporary, that excess would burn itself out, that stability mattered more than truth, and as long as trade continued, borders held, and the streets remained calm, most people accepted the cost. What happened to the girls was treated as unfortunate, but necessary, a private matter. An imperial indulgence best left unexamined. Rome did not need to be forced into complicity. It volunteered. By the time anyone considered resistance, the damage was already complete. The system had embedded itself too deeply. Too many people had adjusted. Too many careers depended on silence. Too many lives were tied to pretending nothing had happened. Caligula did not rule Rome by terror alone. He ruled it by understanding something far more dangerous: that a society will endure almost anything, as long as it does not have to admit what it has become. The change did not happen all at once. It never does. At first, the girls simply grew quieter. Conversations faded into nods. Words became unnecessary when nothing spoken could alter what waited for them. Silence felt safer than hope. Then their bodies began to change. Sleep fractured. Some could not rest at all, jolted awake by imagined footsteps or voices that were not there. Others slept too much, retreating into exhaustion because waking required strength they no longer possessed. Hunger vanished. Food was eaten mechanically or ignored entirely. The palace physicians took notes. They used careful language. Fatigue, melancholy, nervous weakness. Rome had always preferred tidy words for untidy suffering. But the servants saw what the doctors did not write down. Eyes that no longer focused. Hands that trembled even at rest. Voices that responded seconds too late, as if the mind had not yet caught up with the body. Some of the girls stopped reacting altogether. They would sit for hours without moving, staring at nothing, their breathing shallow and slow. When spoken to, they answered politely, distantly, as if the words belonged to someone else. It was not calm. It was absence. Their minds had learned a final defense. If they could not escape the palace, they could escape themselves. This was when the suicides began, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. One girl shattered a ceramic vessel and used the shard before anyone could stop her. Another tore strips from her silk garments and fashioned a noose in the night. Others climbed to balconies and stepped forward without hesitation, letting gravity finish what endurance could not. Each death was treated as an inconvenience. Rooms were cleaned, bedding replaced. Servants warned to speak of it to no one. The emperor expressed irritation, not grief. Broken property could be replaced. Broken obedience could not. Officially, there were only a few cases. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. Fear spread differently now. Not sharp and immediate, but heavy, suffocating. Death was no longer shocking. It was instructional. Some girls watched others choose it and felt envy instead of horror. Death had become an option. Survival no longer felt like victory. Those who remained alive existed in a narrow space between terror and numbness. Too afraid to die. Too damaged to live. Their sense of self had eroded to the point where even suffering felt distant, like something happening to a body they no longer recognized as their own. They were still breathing, but the people they had been were gone. And in that hollowed state, empty of resistance, stripped of identity, broken but functional, the system reached its most efficient form. Because a person who has nothing left to lose is unpredictable. But a person who has lost themselves entirely is easy to control. This was the stage Rome never recorded, the point where the women stopped being victims in the traditional sense and became something far more tragic. They were alive. And that, at last, was the cruelest outcome of all. For years, Caligula had humiliated those who could not fight back. That was easy. Women without weapons. Fathers bound by law. Senators trapped by compromise. People whose survival depended on silence. Against them, cruelty carried no risk. But power has a way of demanding escalation. Eventually, obedience stops feeling satisfying. Fear becomes ordinary. To feel absolute again, a tyrant must push further, toward those who still carry the capacity to resist. Caligula turned his attention to the men with swords. The Praetorian Guard had placed him on the throne. They were supposed to be untouchable, Rome's final shield against chaos. Caligula saw them differently. To him, loyalty was not a bond. It was a weakness to exploit. He mocked them publicly. He ridiculed their commanders with obscene jokes, questioned their manhood, forced them to endure insults in front of their own men. He reduced honor to humiliation, discipline to spectacle. What had once been quiet resentment hardened into something sharper. Still, they endured. Until he went further. He forced officers to participate in degrading rituals. He imposed vulgar passwords, demanded submission not just of rank, but of dignity. He turned service into farce, obedience into self-loathing. One man absorbed this longer than most. Cassius Chaerea had served Rome faithfully for decades. A veteran, a soldier shaped by discipline and restraint, he had followed Germanicus. He had believed in order. Under Caligula, he was reduced to a joke. The emperor singled him out. Every insult was deliberate, every humiliation calculated. Caligula understood exactly what he was doing. He wanted to prove that even the armed heart of Rome could be bent. What he failed to understand was the difference between fear and hatred. Fear paralyzes, hatred focuses. Around Chaerea, others reached the same conclusion in silence. Senators who had swallowed shame, officers who had watched the empire rot from the inside, men who no longer believed survival under Caligula was safer than the risk of ending him. The conspiracy did not begin with ideology. It began with exhaustion. Caligula believed himself untouchable. He had survived illness. He had survived outrage. He had survived Rome's quiet contempt. To him, the lack of resistance confirmed his divinity. He stopped guarding himself. On the day of the Palatine Games, he dismissed much of his escort. The palace corridors were familiar, safe, his own creation. He entered the underground passageway known as the Cryptoporticus, a narrow, dim corridor that connected the palace to the baths. He did not expect resistance there. He never saw it coming. The first blade struck his neck, shattering his voice. The man who had demanded worship could not scream. Blood filled his mouth. Panic replaced certainty. Then came the rest. Blows rained down in a frenzy. More than necessary, more than controlled. Steel driven by years of accumulated fury. The emperor fell, writhing, choking, stripped of every illusion that had sustained him. There was no god in that corridor, only a dying man. Caligula's reign ended not in spectacle, but in confusion and blood, his body left crumpled on stone, his power evaporating the moment his breath did. For those who had suffered under him, it should have been the end. But Rome was never that simple, because while Caligula lay dead in a dark passageway, the system he built was still alive. And for the women sealed inside the palace, listening to distant shouts and clashing metal, the question was not whether the emperor had fallen, it was whether anything had truly changed. The women did not rush toward the noise. Years in the palace had taught them caution stronger than hope. Sudden chaos did not mean freedom, it meant uncertainty. And uncertainty, in Rome, often carried teeth. They heard shouting first, then running, then the sharp, unmistakable sound of steel striking stone. Somewhere above them, something had broken, something important. But no one came to their doors. Minutes passed, then longer stretches of silence, interrupted by screams that did not belong to them. The palace, once so controlled, began to fracture. Orders contradicted each other. Footsteps no longer moved with purpose. Fear changed sides. When Caligula's Germanic bodyguards learned he was dead, they did not grieve, they erupted. Without a master, they became a force without restraint. Servants were cut down where they stood. Officials fled and were hunted through corridors that had once promised safety. The palace became a killing ground, not for justice, but for confusion. For the women, the place without names became a trap. Some fled barefoot through hallways littered with shattered glass and blood, their silk garments tearing as they ran. Others froze, barricading themselves in rooms, pressed together in the dark, unable to decide whether movement meant escape or death. Years of conditioning did its work. Even with the monster gone, fear still governed their bodies. By the time the violence slowed, Rome was already reshaping the narrative. Power does not leave a vacuum for long, senators whispered. Guards regrouped. Decisions were made quickly, not for morality, but for stability. Caligula's uncle, Claudius, was dragged from hiding and proclaimed emperor before the day ended. The speed mattered. If Rome paused too long to reflect, questions might surface. If questions surfaced, answers might follow. And if answers followed, the entire structure, Senate, aristocracy, palace, would be exposed as complicit. That could not be allowed. So the problem was reframed. The women were not witnesses. They were liabilities. What followed was not justice, but management. Those who survived were returned to their families under heavy guard. They were dressed in fine garments, loaded with gold, granted dowries so vast they could silence entire bloodlines. Each gift carried the same unspoken command. Forget. No trials were held, no accusations permitted. The events inside the palace were never named, never recorded, never acknowledged. Officially, nothing had happened. Families accepted the gold. Some did it out of fear, some out of shame. Some because they understood that refusing meant reopening a door Rome was determined to seal forever. The women went home, but home no longer existed for them. They were hidden in distant wings of villas, kept from public view like stains that could not be scrubbed away. Rome prized a woman's purity above her truth, and though these girls had been taken by force, the blame clung to them all the same. Many never married, many never spoke again. Some did not live long after their return. The palace doors had opened, but the prison followed them. Rome moved on quickly. It always did. Markets reopened, laws were debated, new statues were commissioned. The empire congratulated itself on surviving another crisis, another mad ruler, another uncomfortable chapter safely buried. Caligula was remembered as a monster. That made things easier, because monsters can be killed, systems cannot. And the system that had allowed everything to happen, the silence, the obedience, the traded daughters and swallowed guilt, remained intact. The emperor was gone, but Rome was unchanged. Rome preferred simple explanations. Caligula was declared mad, a deviation, an illness given flesh. His cruelty was framed as an aberration, proof that the system worked because it had removed him. That story was comforting. It allowed Rome to believe the danger had passed without requiring it to change. But Caligula did not invent the conditions that made the palace possible. He inherited them: concentrated authority, sacred obedience, a society trained to confuse order with virtue and silence with stability. The garden did not exist because one man was cruel. It existed because no law forbade it, because no institution could stop it, because too many people benefited from pretending not to know. The Senate had surrendered its power long before Caligula was born. The courts answered upward, not outward. The military served the emperor, not the people. Religion sanctified authority instead of restraining it. When all limits collapse into a single person, the character of that person becomes fate. Rome learned this too late. The women who returned from the palace carried the truth in their bodies. Not as stories, stories were dangerous, but as reactions. A sudden touch triggered panic. Raised voices caused trembling. Sleep brought memories that refused to stay buried. They lived on, but they didn't live forward. Rome never asked them what happened. It never wanted to know. Asking would mean reckoning, not just with Caligula, but with itself. So the empire chose amnesia. History recorded dates, assassinations, political consequences. It debated whether sources exaggerated, whether accounts were colored by rivalry or scandal. Scholars argued over details while the larger truth remained untouched, that something like this had been possible at all. Caligula proved that civilization does not collapse when laws vanish. It collapses when laws exist only to serve power, when obedience is rewarded more than conscience, when victims are treated as inconveniences instead of warnings. Rome built roads that still stretch across continents, aqueducts that still stand, legal concepts that survive in modern courts. But it failed at the most basic obligation of any society: to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The women whose names were erased never became symbols. They were not memorialized. They did not reshape policy or inspire reform. Their suffering was absorbed, diluted, and forgotten because remembering them was uncomfortable. Yet their story endures for one reason. It reveals what unchecked power actually does. Not in theory, not in speeches, but in private spaces where no one is supposed to look. Caligula wore a crown, but what enabled him wore respectability. It wore tradition. It wore silence. And that is why this story matters, because evil does not always arrive announcing itself as tyranny. Sometimes it arrives already legal, already normalized, already defended by people who tell themselves they are only trying to survive. Rome survived Caligula, but the cost was paid by those it chose not to remember. And history, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of bringing those shadows back into the light.